Well, that was an enormous shotgun of arguments, I must say. There's no way I'll be able to address them all. So I'm going to cut to the chase of the important items that were brought up. The first item is, he ended there with the argument that I reject the resurrection because I reject miracles. That actually isn't the case I'm making today. The case that I'm making today is most bodies that go missing don't go missing because of miracles. Most dead people who are seen most dead people and most gods who are seen through hallucinations. Therefore, the presupposition must be that even the conjunction of these two causes is more naturalistically common than the supernatural alternative, even if there are miraculous cases of this, even if there are miraculous missing bodies, even if there are miraculous appearances of resurrected people. Most resurrection claims do not involve actual resurrections, and there are dozens and dozens of resurrection claims in the ancient world like this. So the same thing would have to be argued, that we should prefer naturalistic explanations until we can rule them out, and we don't have sufficient evidence to rule them out. Now, another thing he pointed out was, why resurrection? Why would they believe that Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, one reason is that the conjunction of items in Scripture, Daniel, Isaiah, the wisdom of Solomon, all create this character of the Messiah who's going to be executed. They can see it. Daniel says, the Messiah shall be executed, yet there is no judgment upon him. Isaiah speaks of a similar innocent man who will be executed, even though there is no judgment upon him. And this man will die for the sins of Israel, and then God will exalt him, and his days will be prolonged, and he'll be executed despite. The wisdom of Solomon has a similar thing, where he'll be resurrected, and he'll be rewarded for being executed with resurrection. And we also have a recent inscription found with the Apocalypse of Gabriel, which says that the Messiah will be resurrected on the third day, exactly as Paul says. So here we have a conjunction of scriptural passages that could have inspired the Christians to actually come to this belief. When their Messiah died, when their holy man died, Jesus, they would be looking for any explanation for why that happened, how that could actually be part of God's plan. And they would pour through the Scriptures, and Paul says that's where they found these things. In Romans 16, verse 25 to 26, he talks about how there were hidden messages in Scripture that they were finding, that were communicating to them aspects of the gospel. So they were looking at Scripture for these very things. Now, Paul calls the resurrection of Jesus the first fruits of the general resurrection. And he repeatedly says, of course, in his letters, that the end of the world is coming soon. So imagining the resurrection of Jesus seems to have been the cult's way of proving to themselves that God had sent a decisive sign the end was nigh. The resurrection of Jesus meant the end of the world was coming. It was the beginning of the general resurrection. So because they believed the end of the world was coming, presumably because Jesus taught this, which is entirely possible, they were primed to believe Jesus had been raised, as Scripture in fact promised of God's chosen. Now, that's entirely plausible. We don't have enough evidence to confirm any particular theories or to refute any particular theories. It's not ad hoc because it's an actual, natural, plausible hypothesis, and we don't have any further evidence to rely on to actually build what caused these particular visions and what caused this particular message, what caused them to find a particular message in the Old Testament. All religions are unique in their own way in forming their point of view. Now, with regard to the empty tomb, Dr. Craig briefly mentioned at one point that the majority of scholars accept the empty tomb. That's actually not true. I assume this is based on Gary Habermas's article in the Journal of the Study of Historical Jesus in June 2005, where Habermas made the claim that 75% of scholars accept the empty tomb. That's actually not a very high percent as far as consensus goes. 25% of scholars would be actually a sizable minority objection. But in fact, that's not what Habermas measured. He measured 75% of authors who've published for or against the empty tomb. Those who understand statistics might know what's going on with that number. No control for publication bias. If believers are publishing more articles defending the empty tomb, then the percentages will be skewed. There was also a small sample size, only 37 authors who published on this subject. He also excluded agnostics. So all the scholars who aren't sure whether the empty tomb is a yes or no on that are not counted in his percentage. And if you include agnostics, the percentage would probably go way down, so that in fact we have no consensus in the scholarly community as to whether there was an empty tomb. Now, that's that point. Now, there's tons of other things that Dr. Craig has said. Now, I don't think, he says that I'm just seeing things in the Gospels when I point out all of the things I pointed out to you. I think it would be a remarkable coincidence for all of those literary devices to be in there just by accident, or that the entire structure of these stories just happen to correspond to history. For example, Barabbas is actually a very unusual name. It's an odd name. And definitely the fact even if it wasn't an odd name, the fact that it's in that story and exactly where it would have that particular meaning of a parallel between two sons of the Father in a story that exactly mimics the atonement ceremony of the temple ceremony of the temple Jews, that exactly fits the gospel message that Christ is the atoning sacrifice that is dying for the sins of Israel. All of that, I mean, that to me seems quite plainly to be myth. And all the other examples I gave you are quite plainly myth. And most historians, when they see things like this, they agree. And I listed several biblical scholars who agree with me on this. I mean, he says they don't, but in fact there were many who do. Now, he also cites the street sermons in Acts. Now, it was actually tradition in ancient historiography to make up speeches. In fact, we have historians who actually tell us, we don't really know, we don't have stenographers who are taking these speeches down, so we have to make them up based on what we think the speaker said. The author of Acts, of course, is therefore fabricating these speeches to suit his case, and that's actually very common and commonly accepted in ancient history. We understand this is the case. Now, he mentions that the empty tomb is implied in 1 Corinthians 15, but the fact is, Paul doesn't say the tomb was found empty by anyone. He only says that people saw Jesus. And we don't really know what evidence they actually had that the tomb was empty, or even if they believe they did. He also says that women can't serve as witnesses in a Jewish court of law. That's actually completely false. In my book, Not the Impossible Faith, I conclusively demonstrate that they were in fact widely accepted as witnesses in Jewish courts, and in Roman courts, and in Greek courts, and that they were even used as sources for historical information. There wasn't anything intrinsically embarrassing about having a woman as a witness. But in fact, the women are not there to provide testimony to the tomb, because this is symbolic fiction. The women are there to symbolize something. There are many things they symbolize in this story. I mentioned one, that they are the least who are the first. It exactly represents that. It also fits the fact that Mark builds his empty tomb narrative using one exact phrase and other concepts from the Jacob's Well narrative in Genesis, where we also have women involved asking the same question, who will move the stone for us? Using the exact same phrase, and also it's a woman speaking. There's many reasons why he would do this. Another reason he would do this is that he's creating more irony from the front to the back of his gospel. Mark has his story end with the implausible remark that the women fled the empty tomb in fear and silence, telling no one anything, despite having been told to deliver a message. But this exactly reverses the beginning of Mark's gospel, which speaks of the good news of the voice crying out, of the messenger who will prepare our way, who was a man, incidentally. So Mark even frames his entire gospel with irony, using the women, which means he has to put women here if he's going to create that irony in that story, because the men, of course, saw Jesus and were preaching Jesus, so they can't have told nothing to no one. So to complete the irony, Mark had to put women in his empty tomb story. Women also fit his gospel lesson that the least shall be first, and are easily inspired by his analogy with Jacob's Well. Now, he says the empty tomb story is uncolored by theological motifs. I don't think that's relevant. It's not necessary that when Mark is constructing this symbolic myth that he would put any particular motifs in there, except the ones he wanted to put in there. He also refers to early Jewish polemic in Matthew. In fact, we have no Jewish sources that refer to this polemic. This is entirely first appears in Matthew. It's not even in Acts, which is pretty much, to me, decisively confirms that the Jews were not accusing Christians of having stolen the body. If they were doing that, the book of Acts would show this as a fundamental component of the story of the early church. The Christians would actually have been accused of stealing the body. They would have been brought in an inquiry. They would have been tried for this crime, even if they were let off. So we don't have any example of the authorities showing any interest in this accusation of theft, or making this accusation of theft, even though the Jews brought the Christians in to court many times to try to try them and try to get them convicted of things. This accusation never appears. So Matthew is making this up. And I think he's making it up, as I said, in order to emulate Daniel and the lion's den. It's all a part of his story. And I talk more in Empty Tomb about what the actual motives were and what actual message he was creating with that. I won't address the particular arguments that he raised regarding whether Jesus switched bodies. If you're actually interested in that argument, my Empty Tomb book actually covers it in great detail, and you'll see that some of his arguments don't actually necessarily refute what I'm talking about. My actual argument here today is that we don't actually know what happened to the body or what the original Christians believed about that body. We don't have any reliable evidence for that. The Gospels I don't trust at all, and the epistles don't talk about the missing body or who actually went to the tomb or if anyone did. All right, what else do we have here that is actually relevant to what I'm talking about? I gave many examples in the Gospel of Mark of reversal of expectation, so I don't think I'm seeing things there. You can judge for yourselves whether those things represent what I'm talking about. You don't need to take his word for it or any other particular scholar's word for it. And then he says that radical transformative experience is needed. I'm saying there was one. There was a hallucination, exactly like you have other cults when they're facing failure. They have revelations, experiences that tell them how to move on, how to reinterpret what has happened to them. And I'm arguing that this is what happened in this case, and we don't really have any way to disprove that because we don't have any really good evidence as to what was actually going on in the original church. And he argues that no naturalistic theory can explain all the facts. Well, it's